I just couldn't accept the idea of my family being under the Nazis. And so I had to find some way of making a contribution to the war.
In the early years of the war, Huberty was a night fighter pilot. But in 1942, he volunteered for RAF special duties and so became involved in one of the most extraordinary and effective operations of the Secret War. Flying from the Sussex coast in an unarmed single-engined Lysander aircraft and landing in remote corners of German-occupied France to deliver and collect agents of the French resistance in absolute secrecy by the light of the moon. Throughout 1943, Huberty led A Flight of 161 Special Duties Squadron. He was 24. Commander of B Flight was Bob Hodges. Both flights were based near Bedford at RAF Tempsford.
The trouble with Tempsford was it was a bit far north for operations in France. So 161 Squadron pickup flight, A Flight, used to come down here to Tangmere every moon period. By that I mean 1 week before and 1 week after full moon, because with the aid of the moon it was much easier to find your way over France.
Today, RAF Tangmere is a memory and a museum, the famous control tower a ruin, but nearby there's Tangmere Cottage, the nerve centre of the secret missions. This was the operations room, first and last port of call for so many courageous men and women. The present owner has preserved the spirit of the room, and it's little changed. Huberty's Lysander in 1943. There's a reconstruction of it at Duxford near Cambridge. The Lysander was robust. Powered by a single Mercury engine, it could land and take off within 150 yards. Each had its own code letter. Hugh's was J.
And so I called it Jiminy Cricket. Jiminy Cricket seemed to be a suitable character from the Walt Disney films of my youth. After all, he's pretty good at jumping around the place. And there's one or two important omissions on this reconstruction. One is the lack of the ladder. There was always a fixed ladder on the port side of the fuselage. The other thing is that we had an extra fuel tank between the wheels here, shaped like a torpedo. One of my pilots, who had been a Spitfire pilot, said that Lysanders after Spitfires were like trying to fly a London bus. Well, I think that was quite unnecessarily rude. I enjoyed flying a Lysander.
It required a cool head and a young one. Jimmy McCairns, who'd flown with Douglas Bader. Peter Vaughan Fowler, aged 20. Bunny Rymills, just 22.
And the moon came out. Without the moon, we would have been lost, I think.
Yeah.
You did do one trip, though, I believe, in the dark, didn't you?
I did a landing before moonrise once.
That's right.
Just to see how frightening it was.
Yes.
And it frightened me so much, I never tried it again.
That's right, yes, I remember that.
As commander of B Flight, Bob Hodges had specialised in parachuting secret agents into occupied Europe. He was made commander of the Special Squadron, so he trained himself to fly Lysanders and twin-engined Hudsons by night and was soon lending a hand.
Navigation in the Lysanders was particularly difficult. One had to fly visually with maps on your knee. The maps would fall on the floor. There'd be quite a job picking them up again with a torch and so on. It was all quite tricky. But one got used to it, flying over the same stretches of country in the north of France between the Normandy coast and Loire, down the Loire Valley. One got to know the country fairly well.
Well, this is where I used to cross the Loire, just near the Loire.
I think when God made the earth, he designed in France with the Loire, so we, for the Lysander pilots, because without that we would have been lost, wouldn't we? And the Cabourg Inlet, of course. That
was the best bit, really, wasn't it?
Yes.
This inlet there.
That's right, yes. Once you saw the inlet,
you're right.
The first leg of the trip was underway.
The clandestine activities of A Flight were known to very few people, least of all to the villagers of Tangmere, Sussex, where secrecy was essential.
We were just opposite the main gate of Tangmere Airfield, RAF Tangmere, but the entrance to our car park was shielded by high fencing, so that once the Secret Service station wagons swept in through the gate, they were invisible from the road, and they could unload their passengers, our passengers to be, without anybody seeing them.
Every moon period, secret intelligence agents were driven down from London to a safe house on the Downs near Petworth. Major Anthony Bertram had offered his home for that purpose. His task was to ensure the security of the operation, and inevitably his wife Barbara was drawn into the secret web.
We lived entirely by the moon. Next moon and last moon, not next month and last month at all. They were all agents working with the intelligence section of the resistance movement. They would come down to me at about 3. One of the things I had to do was to go through their luggage, looking at everything they'd bought since they'd been in England, see if it was marked made in England. If so, remove it. Shirts and pyjamas were easy. You rubbed very, very hard with Milton. Either it rubbed it out or it rubbed a hole in the shirt. Now, that was all right. And if they'd bought a new suit, the buckle on the back of a man's waistcoat had to be cut off and the straps sewn together. And then I had to do a horrible thing. Some of them thought that they couldn't withstand torture, they would be sure to talk, and that would mean giving away their friends. And they used to get me to sew a piece of poison into their cuff. But I'm glad to say I don't know if any of them ever used it. It was a horrible feeling.
In the family living room behind the dartboard, Major Bertram built a secret cupboard.
In which we kept the poison, the revolvers they were all given, and the koshes and all sorts of things of that sort they were given.
Missions were dependent entirely on the weather.
And sometimes while we were having supper, a Tangamere would ring up and say, it's off, it's going to rain, it's going to be foggy. Then we should have to have a terribly jolly evening. And sometimes the pilots themselves would come over, which made quite a big crowd in our smallish house.
They would ask us to come and have a little party with house guests to cheer them up a bit, because, you know, they get a bit fidgety. They were waiting for their operation and they were terribly keyed up. And it was good for them to have a chance to chat to some people, and there's no security objection.
We'd always end with a sing-song. And we'd sing Alouette and Sur le Pont d'Avignon and Au clair de la lune and all the sort of well-known songs of that sort. It was always a very jolly evening. We used to enjoy it very much, having the pilots over.
To while away the time, the agents might play darts in the pub in nearby Sutton, but they were never told the name of the village.
Because towards the end, one of the questions the Gestapo asked them was, did you pass through Major Bertram's house? And if they said yes, the next question was, where is it? And they didn't know.
When at last the skies cleared or fog lifted, the message came from Tangamere. It's on.
And then it was necessary to let the people in the networks in France know which field we were coming to. And that was done by prearranged coded messages transmitted after the French news by the BBC.
Ici Londres. Voici notre 8e bulletin d'information. Écoutez tout d'abord quelques messages personnels.
The BBC used to send out les messages personnels, and we used that for letting the resistance workers know when an operation was going to be on. And one of the code names for an operation was Caroline, the name of our goat. So that particular night, the word that would mean that it was on that night was blue. So a lot of messages went out night after night. Caroline has gone for a walk today, and Caroline has done this, and Caroline has done that. Then suddenly, Caroline has bought a new blue dress. That meant it was on that night.
Message très important.
The agent responsible for the operation on the ground would have heard this message, and he would get together his team, what we call a reception committee. They would have got a field which was at least 500 yards long, and into wind, at least 100 meters from the boundary of the field, would be the first pocket torch or bicycle lamp or whatever they could get hold of, possibly on a stick about 3 feet high, to keep it out clear of the long grass. And 150 meters into wind would be the second lamp, and 50 meters to the right of that would be the third lamp. Now, by the first lamp, the agent would wait for the sound of a Lysander engine and then flash a prearranged Morse letter, and the pilot would reply with his downward white light from below the cockpit with another prearranged letter so that the agent would know that it was okay, at which point the other lights would be lit up, and so there would be a triangle, a little L-shaped triangle of lights.
The aim of the Lysander pilots was to land, exchange their secret passengers and equipment, and take off, all within the space of 3 minutes.
If it wasn't a muddy, sticky field, the Lysander would be airborne in about 100 yards.
The dedication, skill, and sheer daring of the pickup pilots is matched only by their modesty.
Really, you can't compare the risks with the risks run by the bomber aircraft going over Germany, whose losses were horrific.
We were all so young. In fact, our oldest crew member was our Canadian rear gunner, who was 23, and we called him Grandpop. But the rest of the crew were, the youngest was the mid-upper gunner, who was 19, and the rest of us were 20.
Fred Gardner had left school at 14 and been a cabinet maker before joining Bomber Command. He was the sergeant wireless operator in a Lancaster taking part in a night raid on Germany in 1943 when they were attacked by a Messerschmitt fighter. Fred managed to bail out of the blazing aircraft and landed in darkness in this field in occupied Belgium, narrowly missing the power lines. At daybreak, he spotted a village nearby and set off in search of help. Then he heard a lorry approaching.
And I thought, it can only be Germans who've got motor vehicles here. So I was opposite a cottage door, so I opened the door and jumped in quickly and closed the door behind me. And there was a window alongside the door. I looked out, and a German army truck went past full of soldiers. I'm sure that they were part of some sort of search party for any surviving crew members. And I turned to see where I was in this room. There was an elderly lady, and she burst into tears. I don't know whether she was sorry for me, because I was a bit roughed up, or whether she was scared, probably the latter.
He'd landed among friends. Quickly provided with civilian clothes, he was passed on to a sympathetic local priest who gave him a further disguise.
He provided me with a cassock, so I was well camouflaged, and a rendezvous had been arranged for me to meet a resistance man in the woods. So we met the resistance man, and there was some danger because we were out in the curfew, and as civilians we could have been picked up for no reason at all other than being out. This chap was armed, and he gave me a pistol and showed me how to release the safety catch, and we set off.
The resistance fighter, codenamed Raymond, was wanted by the Gestapo. German troops were everywhere. They had to pass close to some barracks.
And at that moment, a door opened and the light streamed out, and some German soldiers came out with their rifles slung across their shoulders. And two of them made toward bicycles, which were leaning against the hut, mounted the bicycles and started pedalling slowly towards us. But by this time, we were both in the ditch at the side of the road and crouched down, waiting there for them to pass, which they did very close to us. And what bothered me particularly was my companion pulls out his pistol, points it at the Germans, and kept it trained on the Germans as they passed about 3 yards away. And I was having palpitations there. If we'd coughed or sneezed, I think there'd have been some bullets flying.
At his next secret rendezvous, Fred was equipped with forged papers, but then he was led to a private room in a small hotel.
The doors were locked, and one of the men in the room was Flight Sergeant Herbert Pond, a pilot in the Royal New Zealand Air Force. Pond was in rather a difficult spot. The resistance men thought he was a German plant, and he was in danger of them executing him, in fact. So the resistance men asked me if I could vouch for him. So I asked Pond a few questions, and it transpired that he and I had been on a training station some months before. We hadn't known each other at the time, and we'd witnessed a quite bizarre incident where some Australian crews had acquired some chickens, and they'd flown them from upstairs windows to see how far they could fly across the parade ground. And I think there were bets placed on it too. Well, no German could have known those details, so I was able to clear Pond, and afterwards he said, I'm sure you saved my life.
Gardner and Pond were now on the famous Possum escape route from Belgium down into France. For weeks they travelled together, in constant danger and with only a few words of French between them. Misreading a notice, Fred shoved his way onto a train and into the wrong carriage.
And I was followed by lots of German officers in their very resplendent uniforms, and one or two actually said, "Excuse me," in French as they pushed past me in the corridor. And I thought, yes, you don't know I'm wearing an RAF PT vest.
We had to bear in mind the possibility of some form of prang on landing on fields which were unfortunately going across ditches. And for those occasions, one wanted to be able to merge into the general scenery and not look too much like an RAF pilot. So some of us wore civilian clothes underneath with a little bit of uniform on top, just in case we were caught by the Germans before we were trying to do a run. In the flight line book, which I treasure, there's a remark by Wing Commander Hodges saying, "But of course I'd always want to wear my tunic, otherwise walking into a prison camp they wouldn't know what my rank was." In the moon period of September 1943, which I called a harvest moon, we had nights fit for pickup operations, 12 nights running from the 10th to the 21st of September. Actually, it's an exceptionally good moon period. We attempted 25 landings and achieved 19. We were 6 pilots in the flight at that time, and the squadron commander, Wing Commander Hodges, also did 2 pickup operations with us, one with the Hudson and one with the Lysander.
Huberty was an experienced pilot with night flying experience, which was particularly valuable, and he had the ability to weld the flight into a very closely knit and efficient organisation, and led extremely well from the front and carried out a lot of operations himself.
After 5 weeks on the run, Fred Gardner had reached this house near Reims.
From the last house where we were hidden, we were told that there would be a chance for Flight Sergeant Pond and myself to be flown home. We were quite amazed at this, and I thought we would be very lucky if that came off.
I did a single pickup northwest of Reims, or Reims if you talk English. And this was for the Possum MI9 network, which was a Belgian escape and evasion network.
3 or 4 resistance men arrived together with a Belgian agent, and we set off into the darkness, although there was quite a moon. It was quite a moonlight night.
I remember it as being rather dodgy because for 2 reasons. One was that there was no welcome for me when I arrived over the field, and I had to circle the area for an hour waiting for a light to come up. And the other was that there was a haystack very close indeed to the strip of ground I had to land on.
I don't know whether the aircraft was early or we were late, but the Lysander came overhead rather some time before we got to the landing strip. And he circled round, flashing his identification lights. And I thought, this is impossible. So we had to run the last half mile to get to the field. And then we found that some of it had been ploughed. That caused some consternation amongst the resistance men. But there was a small part left with grass.
The area of good solid ground on which one landed and rolled was much too narrow.
But we quickly set out 3 torches as a flare path, and it was my job as a wireless operator to do the signalling. So I flashed the letter R, I remember distinctly, it was a letter R, to the pilot as he did a circuit, and he came in and over the haystack, and despite a rather big bounce, he made a good landing. We were all crowded into this little cockpit, and again, it was my job to give a signal over a microphone in the back to the pilot that we were clear to take off. The hatch was closed, and within, well, seconds really, we were in the air again and into a moonlit sky, and had quite a reasonable flight home. And we weren't molested by the enemy until we got to the French coast. There were a few searchlights that wavered about, but we weren't picked up, and we came across the channel. Again, we could see everything quite well, and I remember looking down on Brighton, and my grandmother lived at Port Slade, and I could almost pick her house out as we flew over, and of course she didn't know that I was safe. And we came into a beautifully smooth landing at Tangmere. And then, of course, we were taken into the cottage and introduced to our pilot, Squadron Leader Verity, and I had to compliment him on his navigation. I couldn't understand how he could find a field in the middle of France when, as bomber crews, we had, well, I don't like to say it, but quite some difficulty in finding the target sometimes. It was certainly a very strange adventure. I couldn't really believe it was happening to me. It seemed like something out of a boy's magazine.
The reality is that the man who had organised Fred's final escape was dead within months.
Commandant Potier did a number of operations getting our evading air crew onto our flights back to England. But he was eventually betrayed and captured and ruthlessly tortured to get information out of him. And when it got to a point that he had one eye gouged out by his interrogators, he couldn't stand it anymore, and he jumped out of a window to kill himself.
There seems little doubt that the sacrifices made by the resistance and their helpers shortened the war by 6 months or more.
After the war, my wife and I made several trips to Belgium to visit these very heroic people again. And on one occasion, we were interviewed by the press. And as a result, we had several phone calls, including one from a gendarme who, as a boy, had found my forage cap in the field near the crash, and he asked me if I'd like it back. So we went along to the police station, and there was a ceremony when he presented me with my cap, and I think that concludes the story.
Not quite the end,
Here he comes.
as pilot meets passenger 50 years on.
Oh. Captain Verity.
Yes, Fred.
Lovely to see you again.
And to see you, my goodness.
Great. After
Come on into the
52 years.
Yes, come on into the
Thank
wall.
you.